Dead by Daylight is the self-proclaimed Hall of Fame of horror. Most of the biggest film icons are in the game, as well as some of the most well-known horror gaming stars. We've also seen the addition of characters that don't necessarily fit the traditional mold, like Lara Croft and Nicolas Cage. These characters have an already set theme that behavior has to work within. The Shape stalks victims, much like he did Laurie and her friends in the 1978 film. Yeah, it's gonna be one of these videos. The pig offers the opportunity to save a teammate's life by not completing generators, or to continue progressing the trial and risk that same teammate's life due to the reverse bear trap that the pig trapped them in. Granted, these two don't quite work like this in terms of actual gameplay. Myers didn't walk up to Laurie in the movie and stare at her point blank for 2 full seconds before instantly moriing her, and the pig was much more of an overarching threat rather than a physical one after she had gone ahead and kidnapped the would-be Jigsaw victim. Some concessions had to be made in order to create gameplay that was understandable and fit into Dead by Daylight. Another comparison that can be drawn is the Lich. He was actively nerfed in his lore in order to make the running around the wood game actually work with his canonical power level. Licensed characters, for better or worse, have become the bread and butter for behavior in these recent years. Unfortunately, not all of them are a real hit though. The subject of today's video is a killer that has struggled to find a perfect spot over the years. With his rework we received, it's time to figure out if behavior has finally and truthfully fixed the nightmare. First, I want to start with the why. Why does it matter to get the nightmare right? Well, Freddy Krueger is an absolute staple of horror, and he belongs on the Mount Rushmore of horror along with Myers, Ghostface, and Leatherface. Yep, not Jason. I don't like those movies. I'll just leave that hot take here, I'm sure that'll be fine. Freddy Krueger is a media superstar. He has, of course, appeared in his own movies, been referenced in other movies, video games, television shows, and other forms of media. Since 1984, when A Nightmare on Elm Street released, Freddy has been synonymous with the horror genre. He's inspired aspects we've seen in tons of horror characters at this point. You could argue the quirky but sadistic killer trope was made popular by the Springwood slasher himself. He's as important to horror as other characters like Leatherface or Norman Bates. Oh, wait, this is a Dead by Daylight video. Right, sorry about that. This video will create a timeline of events, so you can understand the entire history of the nightmare, and then we'll discuss the killer as a whole, before finally answering the question, was this a good rework? This is going to be a long one, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the video.
This place plays tricks on your mind. Constantly I question whether I dream or if I am awake. This most recent horrid ghoul seems to bridge that gap between the states of being awake or asleep. I saw him hunting another poor soul, someone who was not as lucky as me. A man with a hat and a claw-clad hand. A scarred man of sorts. He spotted me, and what actually happened next is still a mystery to me. Dreams took over, and I was sure to die. But I woke up. Not like in the manner where I awake at the campfire, but instead I just woke up. Inside this wretched forest, with memories of nightmares within. I am now afraid to sleep, but also to stay awake.
So, let's go from the very beginning then. We actually start with the Leatherface paragraph. This story has never been 100% confirmed to my knowledge, but the story goes that Behavior was working on this chapter, yes, chapter, and then they were approached with the idea of having the nightmare introduced to the game. Behavior had to make the decision, continue pushing forward the Leatherface chapter, which included Kate Denson at this point, or stop and begin work on the Nightmare on Elm Street chapter. In the end, Behavior didn't want to risk losing the Nightmare chapter. Because of this, Bubba had his add-ons copy and pasted from the Hillbilly with 0 changes, meaning that the vast majority of his add-ons just did not work. Over time, Bubba was slowly fixed, and now he's in a position where he's relatively okay. But let's shift our attention back to Freddy. This chapter was a bit rushed, and it could be seen, in my opinion, most not by Freddy, but by his co-star, Quentin Smith. Yeah, it's bad. I've heard this version of Quentin be called very, very many things, but I think the best one is Melted Candle Quentin. Yeah, it took a plea from Kyle Gallner himself. Just look at him. It looks like an unknown skin. Yeah, though, immediately, Quentin wasn't the best example of the work behavior had done on this chapter. But let's look at the killer. Oh. Well, I mean, it's okay. Look, it's not perfect. The first big issue that a lot of people can't get over to this day is the chapter is based on the 2010 remake, which is one of the movies ever made. First, I'm going to give the movie a little bit of credit, which is something that I will not be doing a lot of. Jackie Earle Haley, the man who played Freddy Krueger, did a very good job with the slop he was given. Despite everything wrong with the movie, I can somewhat confidently say that Jackie was not one of the problems. So, this version of Freddy being brought into the fog doesn't bother me as much. Yes, I would much rather have Robert Englund, but this is the cards we've been dealt. Especially since Mr. Englund has very publicly advocated for voice acting Freddy again. He said that he can't physically be the character anymore, but he can voice act him. It really is a shame. I mean, just listen to him.
She's recording it?
Yeah.
Welcome to prime time, bitch.
Hell yeah, what a legend. Now, instead of just getting distracted and gushing over the Nightmare on Elm Street films, let's get into the actual gameplay. We need to go back in time to the 26th of October, 2017, when the Nightmare on Elm Street chapter was released to Dead by Daylight. Quentin Smith and the big man himself, Freddy Krueger. This came with 6 new perks and a brand new realm. Let's start with the realm. Historically, Springwood, better known as the Batum Preschool, has been one of the absolute worst maps in the game's history. Check out my worst map and DBD video for the specifics. The perks weren't really that much of a hit either. Quentin's perks, they have their niche usage, to be fair. Pharmacy works well in the item farming build, or just as a way to guarantee a reset in the match. Wake Up was recently butchered this year, and Vigil, in my honest opinion, is one of the best perks in the game. Freddy's perks have had their ups and downs as well. At one point, before the introduction of the in-game claps, Remember Me was actually an extremely good perk. With the introduction of the in-game claps, it caught some nerfs, and then it had to wait until Freddy's most recent changes to get its own buffs back. Fire Up was a meme for a long time, but these days it's actually pretty satisfying to use. And finally, the most interesting of the three, Blood Warden. It's not that good. So, the perks were released pretty mediocre, and the map was terrible. Hopefully, Freddy's power was decent, right? Freddy was comfortably a bottom 2 killer at this time. The only killer worse than him was the Wraith, and even this would change soon. I really wish I had gameplay to show you, but unfortunately it was 6 or 7 years ago at this point. I'll just do my best to describe it, and I'm sure a lot of you already know how he worked, because this is so infamous. But the way that the original Freddy worked was that he would be completely invisible to awake survivors. However, the lullaby that we are all familiar with would be audible while you are awake, unlike how it is today. Once Freddy found you, he would be able to immediately begin pulling you into the dream world, over a period of 7 seconds, base kit. You would gradually fall asleep, and then the nightmare could damage you with his M1. And that was it. Now, granted, he could also see the auras of survivors outside of his terror radius, and survivors who were asleep were hit with a massive debuff to healing and repairing speeds. But the biggest part of his power was that he could put you to sleep, and then he would have to chase you with no additional help. His biggest benefit was that he had an extremely small terror radius in the dream world of only 16 meters. Once a survivor was outside of that range, Freddy would see their aura after a 1-second delay. Something that not a lot of people realized at this time, Freddy was one of the best sluggers in the game's history. At this time, whenever a survivor would be put into the dying state, they just didn't wake up. But this only lasted for about 2 weeks. In patch 1.8.1, Freddy was hit with a series of nerfs. This was motivated by players review bombing the game because they couldn't understand how to play against Freddy, which, and this sounds really mean, is a huge skill issue. So let's cover the nerfs. The time for your aura to be shown after leaving the terror radius was changed from a measly 1 second all the way to a massive 10 seconds. At the same time, his terror radius was changed from a 16 meter terror radius up to the somewhat common terror radius of 24 meters. These two changes alone made the dream world much weaker than it already was. It made the lullaby radius and the terror radius match up in terms of range, which, that's fair. But this paired with changes making dying state survivors wake up once down was enough to single-handedly make Freddy the worst killer in the game. His entire power was that he could put you to sleep, and then he had to chase you normally until he hit you twice. His entire power was being given the ability to M1 you. This version of Freddy was laughably bad, one of the weakest killers ever, if not the worst killer of all time. However, the thematics of Freddy at this time were second to none. At a time where people played in a more immersed way, the steadily rising lullaby, paired with not being able to see where Freddy is, was enough to make an extremely tense situation. Over time, though, the demands for reworks to Freddy became louder and louder, until finally, in the 3rd year anniversary, we finally heard what it was that was going to be changed about the nightmare. And this was the state that he was left in until his rework in 2019. In patch 3.1.0, Freddy was given the most transformative rework we have ever seen. This is something you're familiar with if you didn't start playing within the past 4 months. Let me jog your memory though. Freddy was given 3 new abilities, 2 that he could choose between and 1 that he would always have. Let's begin with the interchangeable powers. We have the original Dream Snares, which functioned very similar to clown bottles at the time. They handed the survivor for 15%, however the difference was that the snare's radius was much smaller and had to be set up as a trap rather than a proper anti-loop tool. He had 8 snares base kit and can move at his normal movement speed while placing them. Remember this. He could exchange the power though for Dream Pallets. These were a tool that turned Freddy into a trickster character. No, not that one. He'd place them down much like he does now. However, they weren't rupturing pallets. Survivors would drop them and immediately they would fall apart, but they would not stun Freddy in exchange. Freddy could swing through and get a guaranteed hit. I've seen a lot of discussion over the years about these pallets and how they were the weakest power in the game, and while I mostly do agree, they were able to completely destroy less coordinated teams and especially solo queue players. He would have 10 of these base kit, by the way. The Dream Pallets were overall fine, but the breadwinner was the snare. The final ability he had was the Dream Projection. This is very much similar to what we have now, with the exception of the ability to teleport to healing, asleep survivors. There is also a much steeper cooldown of up to 45 seconds. Strength-wise, for a while, Freddy was one of the top killers in the game, but his thematics had been completely butchered in exchange for this. He had the Forever Freddy build, which made use of his swing chain and jump rope add-ons. As well as the meta slowdown perks, he was genuinely despised by the vast majority of the community. He received some major nerfs in May of 2021. Snares were taken down to 5 total, pallets were nerfed to 7 total, and the introduction of sleep invulnerability after using an alarm clock. He took a 15% movement penalty when placing snares. Over time, the community's opinion soured until he was consistently considered a bottom 2 or even bottom 1 character. So yet again, Freddy was not in a satisfying spot for the community. So what did it take for Freddy to get past this? Finally, in January 2025, he received yet another behavior-branded rework. We were shown the rework on January 5th. The PTB was received extremely well, however, certain add-ons were incredibly strong and popular. The Jump Rope add-on and the Unicorn Block add-on were the most used. The snare had a 5-second cooldown. Pair this with the 5-second hitter from the Jump Rope, you have to see that going to live, there needed to be some changes made. On January 28th, 2025, the rework went live, and thankfully, there were some small changes made. The Jump Rope and the Unicorn Block were worked partially into the base kit, his cooldown was increased to 7 seconds from 5, and at this point, Freddy's in a really good spot in terms of strength. He has projectile snares that survivors have to actually pay attention to avoid. The Dream Pallets were given a real use case outside of solo queue survivors who didn't have the best situational awareness. The Teleport received a huge amount of quality of life changes and a whole new effect to teleport to sleeping survivors that were keeling. Let's now turn towards the thematics of the killer. Before this rework, Freddy had absolutely no real character at all. He was man with glove who put puddles on the ground and hoped you waddled into them. There was no real identity to the character, so there was literally nowhere to go but up from where he was in his last variation. But why does this matter so much? Why did it matter to get Freddy right? Well, as I mentioned earlier, with all my examples I used, this is an icon of horror, and in my genuine opinion, it doesn't really matter if he's strong, although that is a benefit. He needs to feel like Freddy. For this, I want to circle back to the example I used earlier of the pig. Pig's not the strongest killer, but it does feel like you're playing as Amanda. Same could be said with the Ghostface, although he's a bit more of a weird situation because he's only half a license. Freddy feels like himself. Throughout all of his movies, including the rework, he toyed with his victims, and I think that is perfectly shown through the addition of the Dream Pallets. It's a way for him to fool his victims into thinking they are safe, only for them to realize far too late that they had walked into his trap. Snares are more of a gameplay mechanic rather than a thematic one, not necessarily fitting him in terms of theme, but perfectly fitting the gameplay of Dead by Daylight. So now, the big question I want to ask is, how does Freddy's rework rank against some of the other reworks? Well, recently I called the night the best one Dead by Daylight has ever seen. Check that video out if you want to after this one. But the summary of it is that Behavior took a problematic character that was able to hold players hostage, and also had one of the most irritating powers in the game to play against. Freddy, on the other hand, had one of the weakest powers, as well as an extremely weak thematic side. The rework aimed to make his gameplay stronger, mostly, but in doing so, the thematics were made much better, with the visual rework to the snares, with the arms reaching up to grab at the survivors, as well as the pallet shaking and spewing blood before it ruptures. Finally, we have the new graphic overhaul for the teleport. When teleporting to a healing survivor, hands will now come from the ground and grab a hold of that survivor. It really is a masterpiece in my opinion. It shows the strength of the dream world, and that Freddy is truly in control. The gameplay is much better, and the thematics are both much stronger than they were in the past. I genuinely love it. As a fan of the Nightmare, he is by far my most played killer of the year, and if you've been around the channel for a while, you know that I've always really enjoyed the killer. I was extremely nervous when Behavior announced that he was next in line for some changes. I thought it would end up being some number changes and really nothing else, and he would always be stuck in the bottom of D tier. But I was proven wrong. He got one of the best glow-ups that we've ever seen. The skill floor has been raised exponentially, and the skill ceiling is actually relatively high in comparison to other M1 killers. Compared to his other kits that I talked about earlier in this video, Original Freddy, while a thematic masterpiece, was extremely weak. Freddy version 2 was strong for a while, but there was no real identity to the character. Nowadays, Freddy sits comfortably in the low to mid B tier, and he feels like Freddy once again. It's truly the best of both worlds. And while it might be a bit biased, out of all the quote-unquote reworks that Behavior has done, I think this is maybe not the absolute best, but at least a top 3. We now have an identity and a stronger power. I love the new Nightmare, and I want to help other people come to love the Nightmare. So, while this is going to take me a bit of time, I'm going to begin working on a guide to the character. I'm going to cover all the little techs, add-ons, perks, maps, and more. It's going to be as in-depth as I can make it, so it will take me a bit of time to get it here. While Freddy is incredibly easy to pick up, there's a lot of little tricks and info that take a while to learn, but I want to make that as fast as possible for other future Freddy players. Don't worry though, I'm going to keep making other videos on other characters, maps, perks, add-ons, whatever I decide to talk about, so it's going to be something that I work on in my free time. But if you'd like to see me play Freddy though, and ask me questions about the killer, I play him very often on stream, as well as a good amount of other killers. You can also join the Discord server and talk about any killer you want with my community. As for this video though, this is the end. I spent about a week or so on this, on and off, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider leaving a like, it really helps me out quite a bit. You should also consider subscribing if you'd like to see videos similar to this. This is the longest it has taken me to get a video out since I started in August. They're usually pretty fast, but there was just a lot of research and trying to remember my feelings and comparing that to the community sentiment at the time. But as for right now, my name is Kasir, and I hope I'll see you next time. Bye bye.
Fuck you, bitch.